Good afternoon. My name is David Cassak with In Vivo Magazine, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this latest edition of our interviews with the medical device innovators. You know, in the first 4 sessions we've had, we've really been blessed to have share insights with 4 extraordinary creative individuals. But with this latest of our interviews, Mir Imran, Mir really is, in a sense, in a class by himself. In terms of the number of companies created and the range of clinical products, few people in the medical device industry come close to accomplishing what Mir has. Mir is also different from the folks who come before in that he's not a physician by training. He's an engineer. And for that brings a variety of different perspectives and different issues to bear in the whole issue of company creation. So with that, let me begin the program with Mir. Mir, welcome. Thanks for coming here. You were born in India, came here when you were 17, and landed in New Jersey. How did you get to New Jersey?
It was actually an interesting detour. I was supposed to go to University of Rochester, in Rochester, and when I applied to these schools, I didn't know the difference between private and public schools. And when I came here, I had about $4,000 or $5,000 that my father had given me, and I thought I'd get my whole education on that. When I went to register at Rochester, found out that was enough just for the first year, barely enough for the first year. So I was quite determined to get my education for that amount of money, and with recommendations from various people, ended up at Rutgers.
So you graduated in the mid-'70s with degrees in electrical engineering and bioengineering, and I know that your first job after that was at Rutgers Medical School. Where did your interest in, or how did your interest in the medical side of things, in biomedical engineering and in medical device technology come from?
Well, it actually was a very fluke thing. It was the time when I was just finishing my undergraduate degree, and there was a posting on the bulletin board. They were looking for somebody to help devise interfaces for cerebral palsy children. And so I went there and went to see them, and got this summer job, and started working with a couple of quadriplegic CP children. And it was a very interesting challenge to help them communicate and provide interfaces to machines. So that was sort of the beginning of my interest in this area.
Was that your first exposure to medical issues or medical science?
Yeah.
Yeah, and everything stemmed from that. Your work at Rutgers took you into areas like implantable and non-implantable telemetry and simulation systems and biochemical sensors. How much of what you would later do in your life came out of that early work? How much of it was a pretty significant departure from that?
You know, I have gone back to those 3 years of at the medical school, where I also took some courses, but the majority of my work was in research, and I've gone back to those experiences many times over the years in many of my companies, and part of it was a really hands-on research kind of thing. Did a lot of work in neurostimulation in monkeys and in people, and did a lot of work with biochemical sensors. So a lot of deep work in electronics and chemistry and sensors. So it was a very powerful experience.
Now, I think a lot of people here associate with specific individual companies like Perclose, Perclose. I don't know if very many people here know that you were one of the early developers of implantable defibrillators when you went to work for Intech Systems. How did you get that job at Intech Systems, and what were you doing for them?
I actually led all the development effort at Intech since its inception, and I really didn't know what I was getting into. I had no clue what an implantable defibrillator should look like. In fact, many of the physicians we worked with didn't really understand. Cardiac electrophysiology was not well understood at that point. And in fact, the first device that we developed was designed to only detect fibrillation. It would not detect tachycardia. And we all know that you really want to detect those high rate hemodynamically unstable tachycardia. So it took a couple of years of experimentation and human studies and figuring out why these patients were fainting and going into sudden cardiac death and not getting resuscitated. And so that's when the connection with Stanford began. And that was with Roger Winkle, who was here at Stanford. And I started working with him in collecting data from patients during EP studies. And that was a very useful and very extremely beneficial collaboration. And it led to the first device that the FDA approved, which was called the 8B.
Now, Lilly acquired Intech when, 1985?
It was in, it was in early 85, yeah.
And you left soon after. Why did you leave Intech?
Lilly wanted me to go work for them. And I decided I was really not cut out for a large company. I was pretty involved in the technology transfer to CPI in Minneapolis, and I just didn't like the large company culture.
So you went to work with a company called Vetrix. Now, the ICD technology that now is one of the centerpieces of a very successful CRM business for Lilly started with their Intech, but they were quickly leapfrogged in this whole space by Vetrix. Talk a little about your participation in Vetrix, and what did the advent of Vetrix's next generation of technology teach you even that early about how quickly medical technology can be surpassed?
It was a good evolution, but mind you, Vetrix did leapfrog the electronics part of the technology and some of the therapeutic tiered therapy devices, but they were really far behind on the lead systems. Intech, we had pioneered the EndoTAC, the single lead defibrillation, which really became very popular. So Vetrix, one footnote is that I came to California to help start Vetrix, but I really ended up not doing that because Eli Lilly sued Vetrix and me, and Medrad and Lilly jointly, and it was a
sued you for over what?
They had paid a good sum of money for Intech, and part of the agreement we later found out during the lawsuit was Intech executives had agreed that I would go work for them as part of the transition, and when that didn't happen, they sued the company. There was no non-compete, but unfortunately for us and fortunately for them, they got Pennsylvania jurisdiction where which was not very conducive to entrepreneurs, and so if we had gotten California jurisdiction, that wouldn't have happened.
So you made a slight detour in 1986 for a couple of years, working for a non-medical company, Ascor DataTrack, which focused on encryption technology. What led you away from the medical device field, and more importantly, what brought you back?
Part of the settlement agreement with Lilly was that I wouldn't work for a company involved with defibrillators, and that sort of kept me out of that. And in my earlier life, while I was at the medical school, I had started a company while I was still a student, actually, and I had developed some of the earliest microprocessor-based security systems. So I had some background and thought process that had gone into those things. So it was a natural evolution.
So in 1990, you formed Physiometrics, which does, well, tell us what Physiometrics does.
Physiometrics had an interesting history. Physiometrics, I started the company to, I don't even remember what it was for. It really changed courses quite a few times. You know, I started it to develop apnea monitors, baby apnea monitors, and I was pretty excited about it, but I realized very rapidly that that was not a big market. And I started talking to venture capitalists, and after knocking on a lot of doors, one of medical device investors who is very prominent here, Annette Campbell-White, came to the rescue and made a commitment to invest in Physiometrics. And it was still, the business plan was still not really clear, but she and I, developed a very good relationship. One of her conditions for investing in Physiometrics was that I get rid of this guy who I had, who was my partner. This fellow, David Aarons, who was a very good friend of mine, he was in the real estate business. And one of the handicaps I felt I had was that I had done quite well for myself in terms of making technical contributions. So most people didn't really see me as having any business background. So I had to have a business guy along with me to give the company more credibility. So David was with me, and Annette met him once, and she said, I'll support you if you lose this guy.
How did you break it to him?
I told him, I said, this is reality. So he was very kind, and he left, and we stayed friends.
Now, as I mentioned in my introduction, I think one thing that's truly amazing is if you look at your CV for the last 12 years, I can't think of anybody who's created companies at quite a pace or in quite so many different areas. I mean, a lot of folks take a single technology and spin off a number of companies, or begin with a given clinical area and develop a variety of different technologies. But you've really developed technologies in a lot of different areas. Was the impetus to company creation the various ideas for technology in your mind, or is there something about company creation itself that leads you to say, really, what I think has been on an average of about every 15 months through the 90s, launching a new company?
Well, I mean, to be totally honest with you, I probably shouldn't have launched a few of those companies. And, in hindsight is always clear. There was a transformation in my thinking that took place in the mid-90s. So I sort of look back in the last 15, 20 years, and the transformation was how I looked at starting companies and whatnot. Prior to the mid-90s, prior to 95, in fact, the companies I was starting, I was really struggling with. I knew once I found a problem, I could solve it. The biggest challenge for me was which problem to solve. Mm-hmm. And so as a result of that, some of the companies you see I've done in the early 90s, starting with Physiometrics and then Cardiac Pathways, Physiometrics, meandered a little bit. Cardiac Pathways had a narrow focus in developing mapping and ablation systems for ventricular arrhythmias. The issue was I really didn't go about understanding the problem properly and then developing the technology. I was more enamored by the technology, mm-hmm. and I was trying to fit the technology in some of those cases to a particular problem. And that is what I realize today is that that's really the absolute wrong way to go about it.
I want to pick up on that in just a second and leave specifically Intel as an example. But you've mentioned to me in the past that two of the companies you wouldn't have started were Reflow and Advanced Therapeutics. What was it about those two companies? Because
Intella, I mean, shouldn't have started Intella.
right, we're going to talk about Intel as a separate issue, but
Okay.
those other companies. I mean,
I think.
What was it about them that led you, in retrospect, to say this is really just not the right thing to do?
There were different issues, obviously, with each one. Advanced Cytometrics was really co-founded by me and Trevor Powles, who's an oncologist from UK. And he had come up with identified a problem about getting good samples in biopsy with fine needle aspiration. But he didn't know how to go about doing it. So he helped define the problem. And it was, at the outset, we thought of it as a project. We really didn't put a management team together. So I think it had, there was an opportunity for a brief moment there to merge with Biopsys, which we probably should have done. And instead we merged with Oncotech. But, I have no regrets about that. There was very little money put in, about $500,000 or so. So it was a very small deal.
As you've gone through your experience, and the reason why I wanted to save Intel is because Intel presents a very interesting, I think, case for technology that kind of, where you're getting the sound advice to go ahead, and it turns out that you're still on the wrong path. Where companies have proven to be disappointing to you, do you think a failure of technology or a failure of business execution?
I've had both. Which one would you like first?
Let's do technology first.
Well, it wasn't really a failure of technology. It was the wrong technology and the problem had moved. And I've made this point before. The case in point is Intella.
Yeah.
And I was enamored by a technology, namely ability to steer electrically with using nitinol technology. And I applied that. Somebody said, "Boy, that would make a neat steerable guide wire." I said, "Wow, that was great." But we started to, and that's why it was called IntelliWire initially, and it was absolutely solving the wrong problem, wrong clinical problem. Then we moved into.
Why is that?
Because first of all, the market was very tiny. Overall market at that point for guide wires was 100 million, and Guidant had 80-90% of the market. And moreover, there was no need for electrical steering because a steerable guide wire with a dog leg was sufficient to steer around the vasculature. So I really didn't have a clear understanding of the problem.
And yet, using that Intel, I know this from having spoken to you and Alan Mays here, we did an article on Intel. You were getting good advice. You were getting advice from cardiologists saying to you, "This is great. You really want this. You should develop it."
Exactly. And Alan is sitting here in the audience, and he'll remember that we had a lot of support from physicians, because physicians, some of the kinds of physicians we talked to are tinkerers, and they love new gadgets, and they're really not concerned about how big the market is, where the competition is coming from. They couldn't care less. I mean, majority of them are tinkerers, and we have to learn to filter their feedback and use it appropriately. Another case in point with Intella was we had come up with a really nifty idea of having multiple balloons on a single catheter, and we actually built those things, and they worked beautifully. And the concept there was to have one balloon for pre-dilatation, stent deployment, and post-dilatation. And that's how the stenting began in the early 90s. But by the time we got our act together, stenting had moved to what's called direct stenting, with just doing it all with a single balloon and single stent. And so it became irrelevant.
Was there a connection in your mind between the experience that Intech and Vetrix had in ICDs and what Intel ran into. Only in this respect, I know one of the things that device company executives worry about most is that a technology they've worked very hard on for many years will simply be, will do everything they want it to do and solve exactly the clinical problem that they think it will, but by the time they actually get it to the market, it's been passed by another technology, or the clinical problem's been solved in some other way.
Right, right. And this Intella was one example of that.
Yeah, I mean, how do you deal with that as an issue going forward?
I don't know how to deal with that. I think what I did was, starting in '95, I said I really don't want to get into areas that are mature, like interventional cardiology was, or implantable defibrillators was, and because incremental improvements are, it's harder to build successful companies with incremental improvements. And what I really enjoyed was identifying the problem and coming up with novel solutions that nobody had thought of before. And that's really where what I was talking about, the transformation of my thinking took place with PercuSurge in 1995, where I started looking at.
Let's hold PercuSurge for just a second, because the Intel episode, I think, raised what has to be a central question in our conversation with you, in that you're our first innovator who is by training an engineer, not a doctor. There have to be both advantages and disadvantages to not being a doctor. What, to your mind, are the advantages of not being a doctor, and what, to your mind, are the disadvantages?
The advantages clearly are that when you look at a problem, if you're really understanding the problem, and in my case with Intella, I really hadn't spent enough time with the problem to understand it myself. I was relying on what physicians were telling me. So I think clearly one issue is understanding the problem. From a medical standpoint, if you're a doctor, you have that advantage. But sometimes not. Sometimes you're too close to the problem and you don't see it. So there are pros and cons to both. And what I have done over the last 8-10 years is really jump deeply into the medical issues and forget about the engineering and technology, because to me that is almost secondary.
So a skeptic might say, well, gee, not being a practicing physician, how can you really have an intuitive or practical feel for what works and what doesn't? Do you think that's a canard? Do you think that's a not really relevant issue for you? How have you overcome that?
I just educating myself. It is an issue. I mean, most engineers who tackle medical, who are working in the medical device business today and aspire to start their own companies, face this very tough issue, because they're going to their physician friends and whatnot and saying, hey, I want to solve a problem, give me a problem to solve. And so now they're getting those problems that the physician perceives, and they may be very good problems to solve, and sometimes they're not.
It's interesting, because one company where not being a physician actually helped you, or not having a physician's perspective helped you, was PercuSurge, because when you if you asked a number of interventional cardiologists, even as recently as a couple of years ago, whether embolic debris was a problem in interventional cardiology cases, they would have said no, it's not an issue. And in fact, several doctors that you showed the idea to, if I'm right, tried to talk you out and told you not to bother wasting your time. Talk about PercuSurge and where the idea came from and how the company evolved.
Well, the idea was, the genesis of the idea was much older. It was back in sometime in '92, an acquaintance of mine had undergone carotid endarterectomy and ended up with a stroke. And I tried to understand why that happened, and subsequently I came across another acquaintance who had intervention done on a vein graft and had a major embolic event. And so I started looking into that and dug up a lot of the literature, interestingly enough, I found a number of references to embolic events in European literature, medical literature, than compared to the U.S. In the U.S., if you went and talked to the interventional cardiologists, they tell you it's not a problem. In fact, one other thing that I should talk about with PercuSurge is the relationship between PercuSurge and Intella, and there was some bad blood for a period of time, and a number of investors in Intella were quite upset that I hadn't put it in. So I want to
So people were saying to you, if you had an idea for embolic protection, why didn't you simply root it in Intella and correct the technology problem?
Right. But I had originally actually offered it to Intella, and Roger Guidi was the CEO at that point, and Roger said, okay, we'll put it in, and we'll get to it when we can. And he said, well, I have to do some market research. So he called up, I think it was Steve Osterly or a couple of physicians, and got a very lukewarm, or said, you don't need embolic protection. and I think even Tom Fogarty was very, very negative. And I remember I had gone and presented my ideas to him to get him to invest in, and his comment was, Mir, you've been smoking funny cigarettes again. And I have a lot of respect for Tom, but...
Do you have a reputation for smoking funny cigarettes?
Yes. He was right.
That may be the most candid confession in the series. So, I'm sorry.
So going back to my time at Intella, because this is an interesting thing. So Roger Guidi came back and said, we don't want, give us the technology, we'll issue some more shares, and we'll put it on the shelf, and we'll get to it in a couple of years. And I said, no, that's one of my conditions is the current investors put money in and we work on this thing. And he said, no, we're not really interested. So I took it at that point and formed PercuSurge. And so the challenge then was to go and find investors. And clearly the investors who were in Intella weren't going to invest in it. But I again went to talk to Annette, who was my dear friend, and she agreed to give me a loan, $250,000 as a bridge loan to do some basic work. And at that point she was in the process of raising, I believe, her second fund, Ventures 2. So I took that money and I took a couple of engineers and needed a place to do some prototyping and whatnot, and that's when the idea of Incube actually was born. And so Annette was really, I either had blind faith in me or was incredibly intuitive about this whole thing. But she was the first supporter, and then Roger Quay was really, he and Annette led that first round, and he was also convinced.
And PercuSurge actually was one of the real device success stories of the last several years. I mean, in case anyone doesn't know, they were sold, what, in 2000?
December of 2000.
December 2000 to Medtronic for $225 million before the product even got to the marketplace.
Right.
That must have just been a tremendous confirmation because, again, 4 years earlier you were being told, don't bother, don't waste your time, this is something we don't need.
I think, I mean, to tell that story fully, we also had PercuSurge had a brilliant CEO in Peter Rule, and I think I have learned that, good ideas are a dime a dozen, but it's the execution that matters, and Peter really did a good job.
Mm-hmm. How do you know, though, based on your experiences both at Intella and PercuSurge, in which you followed advice and in one case and turned out disastrous, and you didn't follow advice on the other and it turned out to be successful? How do you know when you're running into sound advice from clinicians and when you're just encountering clinical conservatism, a bunch of doctors who don't want to do something they've never done before?
I think you have to really focus on the problem yourself and get your arms around the problem yourself. and then you know whether it's a minority opinion, one or two physicians think that way, or if it's truly a problem. So you really have to understand the problem yourself. So bioengineers' job is not just to go and do their mechanical engineering or electrical engineering. They really have to immerse themselves in medical problems.
I want to talk about Incube in a second, but before we do that, let's just get to one other recent company, and that's Novasonics, which is another example of a project that started in one direction and then went in another.
Completely different.
Really completely different. Tell us a little about Novasonics and the problem you thought you were solving originally and what it is now doing.
Well, it sort of took a couple of different turns. One was I was intrigued by this whole problem of vascular access, and had seen Perclose's success, and I was sort of trying to figure out if that was an interesting problem to work on or not. But one thought I had was that one of the complications, even with Perclose and other companies that are providing solutions for vascular closure, I felt was vascular access. And going into the femoral artery, often you puncture through the vein, and so the access, the initial access, is not always perfect, and some of the complications are caused by that. So I was trying to figure out if there was an easy way to create a little device that would guide you into the femoral artery. And I said, that's really not a big enough market, but I started looking into that. Around the same time, I started having my new batch of kids, and I'd go with Christine to the OBGYN and play with his ultrasound machine, and wanted to get one of those machines for home use. And
raising the obvious question, what could you do with it at home?
Well, I could watch my babies. Right? I had three daughters in a row. So I started thinking about imaging, and that sort of led me into that imaging area.
And Novasonics now is doing biotechnology.
Yeah. When I started looking at ultrasound imaging, I really hadn't paid much attention to it. I realized how imaging was done. And if, some of you may know it, there's a transducer that is rubbed around on the patient's skin with some gel, coupling gel, and it creates a pie-shaped image. Well, that image is created with an incredibly convoluted approach, and there are single lines of data that is gathered and composed into a frame of image. So I said that's really not intuitively obvious. So we asked the question, Glenn and I, why can't we just do it the way an optical camera works, which is to insonify the whole region and compute, grab all the data within a few hundred microseconds and compute the image. And essentially that's what the new technology is. And it was a big struggle for me, because I had made a conscious decision not to get into areas that were mature. Right. And so there was a departure, and then this was a diagnostic tool, and I hadn't really done very many diagnostic devices before.
Well, but you haven't, although the range of technologies and clinical areas that you've been in is so diverse, it doesn't seem to me there's anything self-limiting about areas you'll go into. I mean, how do you decide what motivates you to work in a specific area? How do you decide where an idea for a new technology or product comes from?
I'm more focused on the problem. What drives me is the solution of the problem, and I recognize that technology itself keeps moving. What technology we create today will be replaced by something else tomorrow, but the problem remains the same. And if we really focus on the problem, we can come up with the best technology. Coming up with the technology is the easy part, and I've become pretty good at that, and there are a lot of people very good at it. It's really the understanding of the problem.
Well, maybe this is a good point to talk about Incube, because as you mentioned before, in 1995, as you were launching PercuSurge, you also launched Incube. You're the first of our interviewees to have a self-avowed incubator. Tom Fogarty likes to dismiss the idea that Fogarty Engineering is an actual incubator. To your mind, what's the proper role of an incubator? Where does it fit in the process between idea generation or technology conception and company creation?
You know, I think if it is constructed properly, it can play a very crucial role. I say that because you know, there is a from the creation of an idea to the creation of a company. Sometimes the gap is large. Most times it's large. And it has to be necessarily large, because a lot of times an idea is funded by venture capitalists, and they find out that the technology doesn't work, or a lot of other problems with it. An incubator, a research incubator like Incube, allows you to vet these ideas, take them far enough along, and then make a decision whether it's a company or it should be a company or not.
You said that you're thinking about how companies are created changed around 1995. Was it your experience with the incubator that made you look at things differently? I mean, has the experience of now formulating or developing ideas first in an incubator changed your approach to the whole issue of either technology development or company creation, or is it really basically the same process for you? I mean,
That's several questions in that.
Yeah.
Let me just tell you one of the basic, you know, the reason why incubators are important to me has changed and evolved over the years. The reason I first put Incube together was essentially to prevent potential conflict of interest is not the right term, but if I were sitting in cardiac pathways and dreaming up a new company and using the equipment and time and space to do it, the investors and shareholders, and correctly so, cardiac pathways would have some right to that new technology. So I thought of creating this laboratory to avoid those kinds of conflicts. The second reason was around 94, 95, I realized that future medical devices are going to be more and more complex, in the sense biotechnology is going to play and biomaterials are going to play a major role in that. And to that end, I had started a little research group called Surface Genesis to basically focus on materials. So it was a combination of a variety of reasons that brought you know, Incube together.
Was Surface Genesis part of Incube, or was it a separate company?
It sort of stayed together. It really should never have been a separate company, and the thought process grew separately and then got together. So.
Well, see, you frame it that way, because I think most folks who started incubators would say that the critical issue for them, or the critical question that an incubator addresses, is how do you know when to pursue an idea and when to let it drop? Incubators are supposed to start early in the process and quickly vet a technology and decide that it either is viable or isn't, and from there you can kick it off. Question for you is how do you make that decision when to pursue an idea and when to let it drop? How do you know whether you're going down the wrong path and when you go? And did your thinking, has your thinking changed as a result of now having an Incube or an incubator to work with? Has that thought process for you changed over the years because you have an incubator with you?
It really has. It has changed, and it has become clarified through doing several companies and projects through the incubator. We've done, I think, 9 or 10 to date in the since 95, and you know, we've sort of tried to standardize and develop a process by which we do market research, clinical research. You know, when Sharon Lake joined me in 4 or 5 years ago, she really brought a resource. Her skills were very useful in bringing focus to those areas which I didn't have time to focus on, which was market research and clinical research. So that was a good filter, and that's still a good filter that we use. And then, does the technology work or not? And also, the other self-limiting thing is, can I come up with a good solution?
Right.
And a lot of times I can, and a lot of times I can't.
What's the process by which companies come out of Incube or stop and simply are an idea that you've worked on for a couple of months and then let drop? How do you make that determination that, yes, we'll form something here?
Well, if it's a really truly good idea and it's solving a major problem, we'll definitely form a company. A lot of times, we'll have, like we do now, several companies that are ready to become companies, but the funding environment is such that we've sort of hit the brakes on launching new companies, even though they're sort of sitting on the shelf.
You yourself, well, we'll get to financing in a second, but you yourself in the past have raised with me, you said you thought the critical question about incubators is whether the model is really scalable, whether you can really leverage enough skills across a couple of companies. Your incubator's been around for almost a decade. Have you come to an opinion about this? Do you think that the model is scalable, or do you find that you're doing a lot of the same work over and over again? For instance, market research, unless you're developing technology in the same space, you're doing a new market research project for each company.
I think the issue of scalability is a real issue. I don't think it is really scalable. It's really the bottleneck is, people like myself who are at the helm of these. How much can we process and whatnot? And if you find several people who are very creative and good problem solvers, would they even want to work together? I mean, that's how you would scale it. It's not just the mechanics of doing market research. It's really the creative process that allows you to form companies, and I don't know how to scale that.
You mentioned before the funding, and we've kind of hit a wall, and I wonder, the incubator model is clearly a different model for, if not technology development, certainly for company creation. How has the financing model, in your experience, changed over the course of the last 12 years? If you go back and look at a company like Cardiac Pathways or even Intella versus what you've done in more recent companies like Cardiovascular and Intrapace, how, to your mind, has the financing environment changed?
Well, financing environment has gone up and down, a couple of times since the early 90s. And the cost of doing business has gone up substantially. I mean, in late 80s and early 90s, you could raise $1 million as a first round, and that was considered pretty respectable. And now you can't get too far on $1 million. And so one of the things that now that I'm focused on is trying to figure out how you can get, really looking at that first money that you raise, and rather than asking the question, how do I build the team and build the company, I'm starting to ask the question, how do I get from point A to point B for the least amount of dollars, and worry about building the infrastructure and whatnot later.
I think a lot of physician entrepreneurs, a lot of physicians who develop products come away from their experience with venture capitalists kind of bruised and feeling in some ways as if they've not been well used by the process. Your relationship to funding source is a little more complex. You have an angel fund, and you recently became an advisor to a large $650 million fund. Do you see things differently, do you think, than Stanford professor who's got a good idea and goes out to the marketplace? Do you have more sympathy with the venture guys than a lot of company creators?
Absolutely. Boy, it was such a change. I tell you, when I started writing my own checks, invest in these companies, it was a complete change. And I used to really ponder why these venture capitalists don't invest in all my companies and give me, big checks. And I finally got the answer when I started writing checks, and it's really true. It's you ask different questions. You see, as an entrepreneur or as a Stanford professor or a student coming out of Stanford who's doing this is asking a different set of questions. And when we put on the investor hat, we ask a different set of questions. You're looking at risk and, how do you measure and gauge the risk? So I have sympathy for both sides.
Now, what's interesting is that for a lot of device company executives, the dot-com craze or mania of 98 to 2000 was an entirely negative experience. It drained away a lot of venture capital. There was almost a complete drought of funding for medical device companies. A lot of VCs looked at the much easier opportunity. Now, there's been a sense of vindication.
And a number of those entrepreneurs became dot-com entrepreneurs.
Right, exactly. And, there's been a sense of vindication the last couple of years because the dot-com guys are now, pumping gas down on El Camino Real. But you actually weren't involved in the dot-com craze. You were an investor, founder of several internet-based companies. Give us how did you succumb to the devil? How did you not stay away from that terrible temptation to join those crazy
Do I have
folks?
to answer this question? Well, dot-com was, internet was, to me, was just an amazing and fascinating thing. I was completely confused during those years because I would see all these companies popping up here and there, and and the jargon was confusing. Everybody was talking about business models and eyeballs and whatnot. So I said, I should jump into this. Maybe this is the wave of the future. And I made some investments, and I even started my own dot-com.
Yeah.
Which bombed.
Talk to us about your dot-com, because you were an advisor, investor, founder of several MD stores.
Right. Well, there was a couple of success stories. Specialty MD was at least for a period of time, it was successful. We merged it with Ventro, Chemdex, and at its peak, that company, Specialty MD, sale was worth $200 million. But it didn't stay there for very long.
We're talking about weeks here, not years.
It was actually 2 or 3 months, and then there was another one. I actually did a company with John Hennessy. John Hennessy and I were investors in a couple of his students from Stanford came and I helped them put together a company called Correlation. It was in applying AI principles to B2B e-commerce. And John had put some money in, I put some money in, I think Casey, you put some money in. But we ended up merging that with Digimine, and you stay tuned, we don't have liquidity yet. And then another small success story was J Street Data. You know those guys. And they were brilliant. They did a great job, and I was going to just put in a small amount of investment, but ended up becoming sort of one of the larger investors.
Great. Well, I don't want to, beat you over the coals with this.
No, that's fine.
Let's come back, because several of your more recent companies have been in a variety of different areas, but most notably, a lot of them have been in the GI space, Interpace, N-Track, Python. Talk about what those companies, what they do, and how did you get interested in this area?
I started looking at a number of medical problems, and I still am. And one of those areas that I started looking at was gastroenterology. Maybe started about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was really struck by the lack of solutions and how primitive the solutions were, both diagnostics in GI and therapeutics. And so I said, boy, this is a gold mine. I mean, there are probably 10 companies. I think there are 10 or 20 companies in the GI track. And so we focused on some gastric problems, such as obesity and gastroparesis, small bowel disorders, and large bowel disorders. So the three companies are segmented in those three parts of the anatomy.
You know, as in your early companies, I noted they were quite diverse, although there seems to be a common thread around cardiology or cardiovascular problems, even though the Sonic started as a vascular access or closure problems. But more recently, as you list your current interests, they really seem very different. Tissue engineering, GI, nephrology, congestive heart failure, artificial organs. Is there a connection there that isn't otherwise apparent? Is there something that links all those different areas?
It does. It's not obvious on the surface. Some of my interest in tissue engineering really originated with my work in biomaterials, and over the last 5-6 years through surface genesis and then later through Incube. So that work has led to some interesting developments and ideas. And again, I've got on the one hand the technology piece, the biomaterials, that are there to solve some fundamental problems of biologic interface and so on. And from the other angle, just looking at disease processes in both in renal disorders and GI disorders and others. So understanding the problems and then not really trying to force fit these technologies, but now I have a much broader sort of technology tool set, which includes organic chemistry and biochemistry, which includes knowledge of working with cells and tissue engineering and so on. So I think that the future in the work that I'm pursuing will, I don't know how successful it will be, but it certainly will be very interesting because we're attempting to solve some major, very complex problems, and probability of success is low. And but we're combining some of these really diverse technologies that poses some really new challenges and creates new opportunities.
You know, one of the things that entrepreneurs and would-be entrepreneurs hear so often is how important focus is. As you look back over your career, do you think you've managed the issue of diversity effectively? I mean, what do you say to folks? Because your career seems more noted for the wide range of things that you've embarked on, the different technology you've played in, than a kind of specific focus. Do you think the whole notion of focusing on something is overrated?
No, absolutely not. I mean, you can't build successful companies without focus. I only allow myself to be at least visibly unfocused or defocused, and some people might claim that I'm completely defocused. But I do have some intense focus for short periods of time on things, and that's what allows me to solve these problems. But you can't carry that into the building of a company. You fail miserably. So I sort of try and separate myself, knowing what I do, from company management, and I try and hire good CEOs and management teams.
Well, let me then end with this question. You're looking forward now, and by all appearances, you've got tremendous number of ideas and tremendous opportunity ahead of you. There's been a theme throughout your career of balancing the trade-off between a company creator and pursuing clinical opportunities. Forced to choose between two different opportunities, one which would create a robust company in a fairly conventional space, or creating a really robust technology, but one that's risky, whose prospects aren't really clear, and you had to choose one, which would you choose?
I choose both. Why do I have to choose one?
No, because you only get to choose one.
If my knee-jerk reaction would be, I choose the riskier, intellectually challenging thing. But I really want to make these companies successful and make a ton of money for my investors. So I think looking back 25 years, I'm much more keenly interested in making money for my investors, and I really because I'm on the sitting on the investors' side of the table as well, much more keenly aware of that need than I was, let's say, 15 years ago or even 10 years ago.
Great. Mir, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion.
Hi, I'm Dan Francis with the Biodesign program. Question is, you've sort of beat the dead horse on really understanding the problem, but in all of these companies, in all of these various areas of medical devices, how have you identified the problems? Have you had a technique, or has it been people bringing you the ideas? How has that part happened, the actual identifying the problem?
You know, I sort of go back to the fundamentals in that. You know, I look at focus on diseases or surgical procedure or whatever the problems, and you don't know if you're going to have a solution for it. So I'm not really worried about that I want to solve this problem. I'm just exploring. I may explore, 5 or 10 different things in a given year, or think about it. And when I say explore, I'm not sitting in the lab doing it. And you start peeling the onion and look at how patients with a certain disease are being treated, how they're being diagnosed, what are the complications, what is the morbidity and mortality, what is the cost, how, cost to the system, how it is to the patient and for the physician. So as you begin asking these questions, you can tease out the problems, and some of those problems you have to live with, and you may not be able to come up with solutions, and some of those may actually be the problem to attack and come up with a technological solution. So that's essentially how I do it, and I'm sure people, a lot of engineers fall in the trap of, I've got this great technology, and I want to solve everything. There's an old saying, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So
there's half a dozen companies or technologies that have come out of Incube. Do they all begin with your ideas, or are you receptive within Incube to picking up someone else's idea and helping develop it?
They're not all my ideas. Two of the companies that came out, one recently is called SafeView, one was Correlation that I mentioned earlier. But all the medical companies have come out of my ideas, but it's not, I'm not averse to collaborating with other people's ideas.
This is a quick follow-up. As an engineer, presumably you're not treating these patients. So do you find out your information through literature research, or?
What do you mean I'm not treating the patients?
I hope you're not treating the patients directly, but
No.
you're not necessarily in the clinic where the problems are. Do you go into the clinic and research these problems? Or?
I use a variety of techniques. You go in and look over the shoulder of a surgeon doing the procedure, or you do read a lot of literature. I read a lot of different things, and talk to physicians. I don't try. I take everything physicians tell me, my physician friends, in a broad range of specialties with a real lick of salt, and really understand how they're thinking, why are they formulating those opinions. And so I spend, sometimes I spend years on a particular problem, literally 2, 3, 4, 5 years before I'll come up with an idea.
Thanks.
My name is Amy Angel, and I'm a fellow with the Biodesign Innovation Program. So it seems like over time you sort of come to this place where you come up with a lot of ideas and develop them. Sorry, I'm a little too short. And I was wondering if you feel like you've really come to the exact right place for you, or how you see yourself developing in the future, more as an advisor to young companies or continuing in the creative process?
I couldn't hear you last part.
More as an advisor to young companies starting up, or continuing in the creative process?
It's a question of time share, and I've always had too much on my plate all my life, And I really enjoy working with entrepreneurs and being an advisor on a number of boards, but beyond being on boards, I love those interactions with scientists and technologists. So I'll continue to do that, and I'll continue to do what I'm doing now. So I think it's going to be a mix. One of the things, I mean, I tell my friends, and none of them really believe me. I'm constantly telling them that in the next 4 or 5 years I'm going to retire from this, because I've been stuck in this twilight zone of startups. I mean, for 25 years I've been in this, between seed stage and Series D. I've never gotten out of that, and it's pretty, at times it's pretty nerve-wracking and tiring. And it really has to do with the two kinds of problems, money and people. I mean, those are the two problems that really take up maybe 70% of my time.
I was going to say, and just know from conversations that we've had, that people's side, it's really been the financing issues that, that have been the biggest burden for you over the course of the last.
And I think they'll continue to be. I think that it's good and bad. I really believe that the good part of not having sufficient amount of capital is that it really forces you to think through more clearly and spend the money, less frivolously. So I think it's a good filter, but sometimes the venture capitalists take it to an extreme.
Yeah. Next.
Good afternoon. My name is John Bashkin. I'm with SRI International. We've just seen Johnson & Johnson get approval for the first drug-coated stent, blurring the lines between a device and a pharmaceutical product. And at the same time, we have pharmaceutical products like Herceptin showing us the advent of personalized medicine. Could you talk about these two trends and how you envision them affecting the future of medical devices, and where you see future market opportunities coming from those two trends?
If I look right at ask too.
Yeah, I don't know how qualified I am to talk about some of these trends, because sometimes I'm constantly fighting the problem of becoming too myopic with my own work. But you do see some trends emerging. One is the marriage of device technology and biotechnology, whether it's pharmaceuticals or biotech proteins and stuff. We are working with a protein we've licensed from UCSF, which promotes cell adhesion, and we licensed that a few years back. It's a very interesting protein, but as a device engineer and as a device guy, it took me a long time to sort of figure out how to do the organic chemistry and how to work with this material. So I think part of the challenge is going to be device engineers will have to step up to the plate, understanding biology and pharmacology and protein chemistry, because you can't really expect a pharmacologist or a biochemist to develop devices. So it's going to be ultimately device engineers who will marry the diverse technologies. It's happening in many, many areas.
Although, as you say, when you weigh against that all the myriad challenges that you face, that's a huge burden to add to your skill set. I mean, it's not like learning what the VC capital, community's like, or, finding out, networking for people. I mean, learning a whole new skill set is daunting for most device engineers.
It's fun,
most developers.
It's fun.
It's fun, okay.
I'm Mike Murray. I'm a student in the Biodesign Innovation Program. Startup companies face a variety of risks. There's the market risk. The market won't be what you thought it was, a technology risk, and even a team formation risk. Now that you're signing the checks as a venture capitalist, as you're evaluating a business plan, how do you weight those risks? Are there any of those that are a particular red flag for you, or are there any of those that you feel are most manageable and you can help the most with?
Well, it depends on the stage of the company. If I'm looking at a late stage company, I really clearly look at management as sort of number one. And, if I'm looking at a very raw technology early stage, I know I can help build a team and I know I can address those risks in the future. So I focus more on the problem, the need, how big is the need, and is the technology the right technology for it, and is the intellectual property in the right places. So you have to look at different stages. If your question is more directed towards early stage companies, then venture capitalists have become more and more experienced that I have seen in the last 20 years at helping companies putting teams together, especially those venture capitalists who come from a operations background, company background, so they can really help you with the team building and so on. Then the majority of them aren't really expecting you to have a team in an early stage company. Most of the time it's a scientist or one or two people, but they're really looking to see if you have, if the market is the right market, is the problem that you're solving is the right, and you're solving it correctly.
Good evening. My name is Danielle Newell. I'm an undergraduate student at Stanford as well as a Mayfield Fellow, and I was just, I share your interest in tissue engineering, and I was just wondering sort of what were your opinions as far as the current administration's restrictions on embryonic stem cell technology and research, and how do you think that's going to affect the U.S., I guess, becoming sort of a leader in tissue engineering research, and if sort of those restrictions continue, then what sort of alternatives do you think should be pursued?
This whole area, I've sort of followed it. I'm not an expert in this area, but I've followed it because some of the tissue engineering work we're doing sort of intersects with stem cell work that's going on. And some really interesting work that is going on is in transformation of adult cells into stem cells, and this is going on here at Stanford and other institutions. So some of those problems may go away as science advances, and it's still kind of murky, how real these limitations are from a science advancing the science perspective. But it is a very exciting area, and it's an area from a device engineering perspective holds a lot of promise in marrying stem cell technology and delivering stem cells to areas. I think that's going to be one of the earliest devices where delivery of stem cells would be needed. But applying stem cells in a tissue engineering and device engineering is also interesting.
Hi, Thomas Lee. I'm also a student in the Biodesign program. You talked about the success of PercuSurge being due in large part to a particularly good CEO. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on what made that person a good CEO, and what someone who's, say, an engineer trying to be an entrepreneur should do to look, or what sort of characteristics they should look for in a CEO in the medical device space.
By the way, I think I saw Peter Rule. Is Peter here? Peter?
Hey, Peter.
Stand up.
How are you? Well, there's the good CEO, and but it's my advice to a lot of engineers, entrepreneurs who want to start their company and want to be the CEO. I mean, it really is a big boost to their egos, right? Carrying that card that says President, CEO. They don't realize what skills are needed there, and it's really the other thing that I see is a brilliant scientist goes out and gets an MBA because he wants to be accepted as a business guy, and I think that's such a waste of their talent. And now in my own case, in the early part of my career, I really struggled with this whole issue, business issue, how, honestly, in the early 80s when I was doing some of my early companies, I didn't even know how to read an income statement or a balance sheet. And I had never taken a single business course or an accounting course, so I really had to educate myself in that. But I'm glad, in a way, that I really had kept to my strength, which was science and technology. I think CEOs, there are so many attributes we can talk about that, but you should go and shake Peter's hand, give you a good example of a good CEO.
Great. Any other questions? Mir, thank you very much.
My pleasure.